All right. This week on the Weird and Strong podcast, welcome in my brother, Jaymes. How are you doing today, sir?
Doing well.
Awesome. Great to hear it. Great to see you as we start everybody here on the Weird and Strong podcast. We got a weird question. Are you ready for the weird?
I am as ready as I can be at this moment.
Awesome. So consider a tree. You know, we have a part that's above the ground and a part that's below the ground.
Mm.
Is the main component of the tree the trunk above the ground and it's wearing the earth like shoes? Or is the main component of the tree the roots and the trunk is like a snorkel?
I think that's a really beautiful question, actually. When I think about what the most important piece of a thing is, I think about how it fits into the story of things, right? And so if we think about it in terms of one piece of the timeline of a tree, the different aspects of it will be different parts of its hierarchy, right? And where it fits into the pattern of things. So at one point in its life, say, for example, after its death, right, when the trunk is laying on the ground and the roots are no longer providing it life, the stump becomes a monument to its history. And that's the most important part.
Yeah.
At the very beginning of its life, it has neither a trunk nor roots. It has all of its future contained within its seed.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that's its most important part, right? Where it has all that potentiality. When it's beginning to grow, you've got the main work of it is being done under the ground. It's pushing down, exploring, it's laying down roots, right? Laying a foundation. And then the leaves, the sapling is only really there to nurture it and supply it so that it can build that foundation. It's like peeking above the surface, more like the snorkel. I love that picture. But then later on, when it is standing strong and filling a role within a forest, and the canopy of it is providing shade and support for animals and plants and the larger living ecosystem, when it becomes part of the community of nature, the trunk and the branches are the most important part. And so depending on its life cycle, depends on which part of the story it's playing, which depends which part of it's going to be the most important part.
That is the most coach answer I have ever heard, because that is my favorite answer as a coach is it depends.
Thank you.
Thank you for that very eloquent explanation of it.
A very elaborate it depends.
I very much appreciate that. And with that, let's talk about Jaymes. This is the Weird and Strong podcast. We're looking for to find people who are living unconventionally, things that are outside of the norms. So what are the ways that you show up unconventionally or weird in the world?
I like that question, and because most of my life I have taken a strong position of identity with the eccentric. And I like to use the word eccentric in particular, and have used it for some of my old blogs and whatnot, as the eccentricities or something like that, because the term eccentric doesn't just simply mean chaotic or just weird for the sake of being weird. It just means that it's off center, right?
Yeah.
Which means it has a different center. It has an internal coherence, an internal consistency, but it's just a little bit off center from what you would normally expect.
Outside of the average.
Exactly. So if you have the default modes of life, the default patterns that we tend to go by that are driven by any number of forces, and then if you just hold true to a center, right, you're not going to follow in with a lot of those defaults by nature, because you're going to hold strong on certain things. And even if you have an internal consistency, you're going to be slightly eccentric because everybody else is molding in various and shifting constantly. So if you're holding to a center, that actually becomes eccentric in many cases nowadays. And so my whole paradigm has been not simply being weird for the sake of being weird, but having a center and a cohesion to that center, even if that's not the default. Question the defaults, be intentional across all of life. Then the other portion of that question, I believe you asked or foreshadowed, was, where did that come about? Why why is that my default to do that? To think in that way.
Was it something that you just always did, or was it something that you consciously made a choice?
It was something that was handed to me. It was a tradition that was handed to me by my father. The reason why my mother married him was because of a deeper level of intentionality and purpose in his life. He was a very intense person, very thoughtful, very engineering in mindset and demeanor and so on, even from his early years. And when he set out to do a thing, he just went fully in, right? Like he had studied like the book of John in the Gospels, and he recognized like this is like the linchpin of much of Scripture. And so he, for a long time, I don't remember if it was years or months or so, but he read it through over and over and over and over and over again. Later on in my life, I actually followed a similar pattern on rereading through it. I actually understood my dad a lot more once I had read through it over and over again. I think what I did was, because there's, I believe, 21 chapters, if I remember right, and which is divisible by 7. And so I'd read 3 chapters a day, equidistantly 7 chapters apart. And so every week I'd read through the entire book so many times or something like that. Some kind of cycle that fit in with the number of it. And it was really interesting and fascinating. But that kind of mindset of like taking a thing like, oh, this is a good thing, and you just dive at it all the way, right? Just saturate yourself in it. So when he got married, he kind of looked at like, how do you be married well, kind of the question, you know? And he looked at what it means to have a family, and he looked at his family and my mom's family, and like, there's a lot of issues here. There's a lot of brokenness. There's a lot of generational issues that have come into play, and he did not want to continue on. And says, okay, so in order for me to break from that, there needs to be something to replace it with. So I need to be intentional about crafting our family, basically engineering our life, right? And so he just like read all the books and studied all the things, went to all the seminars, and did all the hard work of figuring out how to examine one's life, not just within for oneself, but within the small community of a family. So I grew up in this family that was engineered. Like every little thing about how we did everything had a reason behind it. I might not agree with all those reasons now as I've grown and studied and developed my own ideas and things like that. But I grew up in an atmosphere in which everything had a purpose. Everything had a reason. Nothing was by default. Everything was researched. Everything was studied. The frequency at which he reminded us to take small bites and chew with our mouth closed at the dinner table. It just was an engineered thing. Like I said that as a verbatim quote that I just grew up with from like, take small bites, chew with your mouth closed, was a phrase that he said over and over and over and over. It's just like a part of like an echo of my childhood of how to eat properly.
Likely, does it to this day, when you sit down to a meal, do you hear that in your head still?
Yep. And it ties into so many different aspects of, the values and priorities in our life, because a large part of what we did was built around being healthy and having a good, strong sense of taking responsibility for our health, but not following fads, but doing the cheaper, more affordable, practical things of healthy living. And one of the most important things for people think about diet and what you put in, but also how you put it in is also important. Chewing your food thoroughly is the first step of good digestion. So if you want to digest your food properly, you want to chew it thoroughly. And one of the best ways to do that is take a smaller bite and chew it more. Right. And if you're talking while you're eating, while you're chewing, you're not going to chew it as well, because you're not thinking about the chewing. You're not thinking about the food. You're not present with it.
Correct.
So taking a small bite, chew with your mouth closed, are 2 very practical reminders that you can cue your mind with that resulted in better chewing practice, which resulted in better diet, as well as more polite around the table. So it wasn't just etiquette. It was fully integrated the entire value structure of our family. So that's kind of an example of the level of intentionality and how everything had multiple reasons for it, and nothing was ever done for only one reason.
Got it. With that as your background, what has that led you to in this eccentric type of lifestyle? Like, how has that come through in your adult life?
in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, go ahead.
I try and encompass as much of my life with that particular philosophy as possible. So as many areas there are in life, as there are as many ways in which it's impacted me, I suppose you could say. I take a few examples, though. Classic one that is passionate and dear to my heart is dancing. I think we've discussed this before. I'd grown up and there wasn't really, in our community and around us growing up, there wasn't really much of a focus on dance. There wasn't really a purpose for it. It didn't really integrate with our family culture. It just was kind of absent. And then, but we always we would watch movies, Sound of Music or things like that. And it would have dancing in it. Like, oh, that's beautiful. Or I'd, watch YouTube and I'd see something that had dancing. I was like, oh, that's really amazing. I really loved it. And I'd read old books. We read lots of old books. Reading was a huge part of our education. And reading about, the balls and the social dances of the, Edwardian era and prior and all the way back historically. I read about Alexander Dumas was a good favorite of mine growing up, with the Three Musketeers and Man in the Iron Mask and Count of Monte Cristo and all of these, and how much dancing as part of the court and part of being a gentleman and part of the whole honor culture and things like that was always kind of woven in there. And I always admired that. So I always had this idea that dancing and fencing were things that used to be in our education, that should be in our education, but weren't, right? Because these are two things that have been classically included. But as an idea, I had never learned it myself or integrated into my own practice until many years later, just actually only a few years ago, really, around 4 years ago, I first had the opportunity to encounter ballroom dance and fencing at the same time, actually, with the Banquet and Ball over in Yakima, Washington, where they were given a role. They're given a functional place in society. And I encountered them not from the lens of someone putting on a performance to watch, which is how we typically encounter the arts nowadays. Yeah, in general, right? And that tends to lend to this perception of, if I want to do this artistic thing and this artistic endeavor, I need to be doing it with the intent of, and for the purpose of becoming excellent at it well enough to perform it, either competitively or for money or something like that, right? Which excludes a lot of people. I have other priorities. I have other things I want to do. I don't want to make this my career or this my thing. And that's a lot of work. And I'm competing with all these other people who have already been doing it since they were 5. So I'm already, 10, 20, 30 years behind the ball, right? So why would I start now?
So it's what I mean? A performative version versus an experiential version.
Exactly that. So this is the first time that it was taken off the stage and put into the hearts and lives of a community and in a culture, where this actually served a function, not in service of the showing of it, but of the doing of it as a beneficial thing. And that just completely blew my mind. It has completely transformed my entire approach to the arts, my entire approach to life in so many different ways. It kind of opened this entire door of, oh, these things had function. That's one of the things that I think one of the reasons why so much of international folk dance communities and cultures struggle nowadays is because they're treating it as a performative thing rather than an integral thing.
Yeah.
Right. Even if you're doing it together, you're doing it as a social thing. It's still this kind of externalized thing. You're looking at it in a glass case kind of idea, rather than actually coming to it to be changed by it. Right. So that's why I encountered it in that kind of a context, where this is actually something that flows and interacts with you directly. And so that's when I first encountered dance as a part of being human. And sword fighting as a part of being human in that way, how it changes you and transforms you. So now that kind of sparked a history, a exploration and a research into antiquity. And what are these things that we used to have as a normal part of everyday life that are functional parts of being human in community that we've either put in a glass case or forgotten completely about? The way we eat, the way we drink, the way we dance, the way we play games, the way we sword fight, the way we discourse, the way we may come to decisions, the way we appoint leaders, the way we organize ourselves, the way we schedule time. So many, these are all different things that I'm researching and studying currently, actually, trying to figure out what are the blind spots that we have now that we're missing, that we should bring back in some way? Or how can, I mean, and of course, the more I study, I'm like, I have radical ideas on intellectual property. And like, if I actually persuade everybody to adopt my idea, the entire world would collapse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's built on these edifices that, like, on a fundamental philosophical level, I disagree with. Like, this shouldn't be this way. But I also recognize that if it went back, it would break everything. So I'm wrestling right now, actually, with, well, how do I stay true to what I believe how things ought to work without calling for complete apocalypse?
Or such a massive paradigm shift into the expectations of how modern life should be. Like, another guest and I were just talking about this just last week on another episode of, coming back to the idea of a tree, is that when we look at even 200 years ago, what was the likelihood of our ancestors in the middle of winter trudging their way across town to go to work? Many times it was, or many times because they were farmers, there's nothing really to do. There was a lot less to do. Right. And so that's one component that I've been considering quite a bit recently is that seasonality, like making hay when the sun shines, like making sure that finding those expectations for myself that, this is, we're in the middle of summer or getting close to the middle of the summer or the start of summer, however you look at it. Meteorological summer versus seasonal summer. And that's, for many people, it's a peak area of productivity. They feel much more at ease doing things become a lot easier, and being able to live in that season much more effectively, and especially setting expectations for ourselves in that area of like, okay, I know I'm going to naturally have a lot more energy right now. Right. That energy in the middle of December or the end of December into January likely is not going to be there as much. So what are the things that I can set myself up for that allow me to honor those seasons a lot more effectively without sacrificing productivity or sacrificing my lifestyle or putting myself into a hurtful situation financially, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, because there is this paradigm, and it's kind of like a paradox, a struggle that we have with society, because ever since the Industrial Revolution, there's this kind of expectation that humans should be like machines. Yeah. That have there's a perfect constant setting. And the idea of productivity is to configure and calibrate ourselves so that we operate consistently at that one perfect setting. A perfect level of happiness, a perfect level of satisfaction, a perfect level of productivity, and that all of time you mashing in as many different things that operating at that level of peak productivity. And that's just nonsense. Like, that's just not how things that live work.
Sounds like a terrible world to me. Like,
it's a terrible world.
It sounds boring.
It's completely boring. Yes. Like, you think about anything that lives, that breathes, that moves, that gives birth, anything that has life, that creates life, right? They all operate in cycles. We inhale, we exhale. There's those natural pauses at both ends of that. You have the heartbeat where there's a contraction and then there's a relaxation, and both of those are functional to keeping us alive. So, like, when you think about rest, people think of it in terms of not doing things and not being productive. They have to justify that lack of productivity. I'm like, no. These are two things that integrate with each other. The activity and the rest are both integral parts of good quality humanhood.
One of the best lessons that I had heard with that was rest is part of the work.
It is 100%. It is.
Yeah.
And you can't do it without it.
We think that from a vibrational perspective is peaks and valleys.
Yes. All of nature is built like this.
Yes.
So I have to ask you this, though. Here's returning this question similar to the tree question. Is the work there for the rest, or the rest there for the work?
Yes. And cop out on that answer.
Because you think about the paradigm that we struggle with nowadays. Like, when you look at the history of when they instituted the 8-hour workday and the 5-day work week, the entire premise that they argued for that was that they needed the rest in order to work better.
Yes.
Right. But then you can also look at it from the other side around, where everybody's working and hustling in order to be able to retire.
Yes.
Trying to earn this arrival at some future bliss. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to be miserable now for then, which there is an element of, delayed gratification is a fundamentally important aspect of maturity and growth. But also, if you're taking your entire quality of life and putting it off into the future, mm-hmm. what do you have now? What is the purpose of that? Yeah. Are you working for the rest, so the rest is there for the work? Or is it really neither? Is both of them valid and good quality aspects of being human? Working and resting are both parts of what we're called to be at every moment, all along our life.
I would personally go towards that latter of that they are so intertwined, again, because you can't necessarily continue to work if there is no rest.
Right.
And vice versa. You can't rest, you could attempt
resting without a end or a purpose or a meaning to it is torture.
Yes. Well, and you will find yourself try to spend 3 days in bed and do nothing but sleep. Like there gets to be a point where you're like,
it sucks.
I can't do anything. I need to occupy my mind. I'm not able to sleep any longer.
My wife recently hurt her ACL, and so I've been trying to help her to relax and not do as much, right? Yeah. And she grew up with a upbringing where if someone else is working, like doing household chores and whatnot, you should be doing it with them. You can't just sit and watch somebody else work. Kind of like don't eat in front of somebody. That kind of ingrained politeness kind of idea. So it's really hard for her because I'll just be doing stuff around the house, taking care of it for her so that she can rest. But then it's anxiety inducing for her to actually let me do that because then she has to hop up and go do something. I'm like, no. I'm doing it so that you can sit. Mm-hmm. It's difficult.
It can be, definitely. Especially when we make those expectations for ourselves. Mm-hmm. In coming back around, that was one area that you're looking and exploring. Are there other areas in this arena that maybe don't have to go to a point of driving an apocalypse, but like areas that you could find that could be really helpful for folks, especially the listeners who are tuning into this episode?
Yeah, I've been one of the things that actually, in connection with this aspect of rest and work and whatnot, is a reorienting of myself towards how I think about time and helping my clients think about time. I just recently finished a book called 40,000 Weeks. Really excellent book about the finitude of time. Like on average, we each have about 40,000 weeks to live, which isn't all that much.
Yeah.
And we all have discretely 24 hours in a day. There's no variation in that. Mm-hmm. And so much of the productivity guru space, which, speaking as a productivity coach, I see this a lot, and I read a lot and I study a lot in this space, and I talk with other people who are in the same space, and he's right. This is really common. It's a really common trap that I myself have fallen into at various times, and I constantly trying to get myself back out of again. But it's constantly embraced frequently by the productivity industry, is this idea of the goal of productivity is to increase your output, right? You're trying to get more done. You're trying to keep up with things, right? And there's the classic illustration of like the jar with the large rocks, small rocks, the sand, and the water. Or if you put it in with the sand first, and then you put the small rocks in, you won't be able to fit the large rocks in. You start with the large rocks, put the small rocks in the sand, then you can put the water in, and you fit more in, right? And all this kind of stuff. And he points out that only works if you're handed the exact right number of large, small rocks and sand and water that fit into the jar, right? Because you have the same amount of jar as everybody else, the same size, the same 24 hours. The problem is that there's an infinite number of rocks. There's an infinite amount of sand. There's an infinite amount of water. Mm-hmm. You can't do all the things. Mm-hmm. Not even all the things that you're aware of, not even all the things that are handed to you. You can't do all of them. And doing a little bit more than you were doing before makes no significant dent when the gap is infinite, right? So why? Like, why are we trying to focus on this quantity aspect of constantly jamming more and more quantity into the limited time we have for some undefined future goal? Instead, try and focus on looking at the entirety of the time span of our life and like, okay, this is what we have. How can I improve the quality of all that across the entire spread of that timeline from beginning to end? Which you can't do that at a distance. All you have is the moment you have right now. So how can I right now improve the quality of my life, i.e. my time, right now? And I can do that by being fully present and engaged with you instead of sitting over here and, doing it with my phone or thinking about what I'm having for lunch or, having my screen off and just like yawning in the background. Like I'm fully engaged and conversing with you and thinking on multiple levels and fully present and enjoying this conversation. Right. Because having these kinds of human connections, I believe we're thinking about function of different aspects at different points of time. Human connection is like the thing we're all here for. This is the purpose that other things are there for. Right. Some people may think of this as like a modality of like I'm investing this time in order to gain exposure, in order to get more leads, to make more profit. But then like we reversed it. Like, what am I going to do with that profit? What am I going to do with that money? What's the goal of that?
Yeah.
Well, to create more human connection. So I'm doing that right now. Why don't I just forget about all that and just enjoy the engagement right here?
Well, this is what I mean? You're talking about with in regards to retirement as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that I'm doing all of this. I'm working really hard right now so that I can spend time with my family when I'm 65 or whatever. What's preventing you from doing that right now?
Yes, exactly.
That's usually the answer is that we are the things that are in the way. And to your point, also, to call this back to the eating, is that being present with your food changes that experience so much as well.
100%.
That's great of the way that it helps with your digestion, and also we live in such a state of excess. We look at not even all that long ago, the issues of the world were in deficit. There was a lack of food. There was a lack of resources. Now we're in a space where there's so many resources. And now we have to learn how to deal with having an excess of resources. And with that comes, types of foods that are highly palpable, things that are highly caloric, that cause all kinds of well-known health issues because we're not necessarily present with it. We're in a space of consume. Well, if 5 French fries were great, 5,000 is going to be even better, right?
Yeah.
And so I really like what you're talking about in this regard because it echoes a lot of the things that I've been working on. Is presence in the moment, and presence with yourself, presence with others, presence with nature, with your food. Yeah, because the moment we're having right now, we can have similar moments, but we can't have this exact same moment twice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of looking at every single thing that we are doing as the thing we should be doing, right? Do the right next thing, And part of that is not so much, there's the whole thing around whatever her name is. I can't remember her name. Does this spark joy? Gal?
Kondo.
Yes, thank you. And people joke like, well, my vacuum cleaner doesn't really spark much joy. It makes me kind of grumpy. I don't want to vacuum the floor, And she has to modify and okay, so there's different categories of how you ask the question about how does this spark joy. Does the clean floor spark joy? Well, yes. Okay, so this is a tool to that end, right? This is a way you provide yourself with the gift of a cleaner floor, right? So that should therefore spark joy. You have to exert a little bit of effort to choose. So this is where it comes into play, right? We have to look at that and say, I'm doing this thing right now that is uncomfortable. This is a delayed gratification piece, right? Where it actually fits in. I have to connect that future good, right? And invest this intentional difficulty, this boring task of vacuuming the floor. But what's amazing is that when you do that, when you connect a current hardship to a future purpose, right? That's where hope is born. That's what hope really is. Whenever you take any hardship and you say, okay, I can orient this towards a meaning and towards a purpose, that it helps us to transcend that hardship and allows us to grow through it, to become stronger through it. And we are actually empowered to be grateful within that hardship and thereby find joy. We create joy in the moment by that route. right? We empower ourselves to be patient. Now this may seem trite. And people complain about it, like, well, you're just trying to make me like to wash dishes. Like, well, yes, actually, if you like washing dishes, your life will be much nicer. You'll enjoy much more of your life if you like washing dishes. Yeah. Besides the therapeutic benefits that it brings you.
Especially if having dirty dishes causes you anxiety. And
exactly.
If you're a type of person that just, it doesn't, you don't even notice it, then okay. I mean, there's
it's not as big of an issue.
Yeah.
No, I would bet a large amount of money that if you're in a relationship and you don't care what dishes, your spouse probably does care. Yeah. So you want to do it on their behalf at least.
Very rarely do you get two people who don't care about.
Very rare. Yeah.
But there's also going to be a point where then you get to like, well, I would like to eat off of a clean plate.
Eventually, that's practically speaking, it's helpful.
Yes, and something that you said about that struggle component. Mm-hmm. Is in this is a beautiful analogy, and it's not even an analogy, it's a fact of nature. If we take a butterfly that is fully formed in its cocoon and has not yet burst from its cocoon, if we would open up that cocoon for the butterfly, it will never fly.
Yeah,
it's in that struggle of breaking through into that next thing. And you said it very well, because that even happens in our small day-to-day. If we think about it from a perspective of the times where, I started one small thing, it led to another small thing, and it kept going, and I kept that going, and all of a sudden I felt like I had this amazing momentum and this amazing motivation. It's like, did that just magically happen? No, it happened by getting a little bit
incrementally, small steps, making the habit would shape the identity. Absolutely. Yeah. And the thing is, like, this is it's difficult to overstate how powerful this is in the small things. Just the day-to-day moment, because that's what most of our life is made up of. And that's where the bulk of our identity is shaped, is in those day-to-day, moment-by-moment choices. So learning the skill of choosing hope and patience and gratitude and joy in the moment-by-moment bits of both work and rest, choosing to be still, choosing to be present with our breathing, choosing to be quiet and rest, and sleep. It improves our insomnia for sure.
Yeah.
But also in the hardship, and when we're doing a plank and we're just really bored and exhausted and shaking and quivering because it's 2 minutes in and we're wanting to kill ourselves, type of thing, like choosing
or holding
your arms up. Yes, that was a really great exercise. And then like my shoulder was sore afterwards for a while. Really good though.
We're talking about a dynamic meditation that we did during our Hair and Tag Men's Day retreat. But anyways, I'm sorry for the interruption.
No worries. But also like washing dishes, or writing a code, a program, or writing a story or poem, or laboring in the fields, doing creative work, whatever we're doing, whether it's hard or easy or hard for it to be easy. In those moments, we need to choose that same pattern of hope. Finding meaning and purpose and connecting to it and all these kind of things. Because even like when something amazing and great happens, it's so often because we haven't practiced it in the hardship, we miss all of the transcendent moments of life. There's points where people will go onto like the brink of the Grand Canyon, right? And it's so touristy, or they make it very easy to get there. They get there like, oh, wow, that's very cool. And just walk off and they forget about it. Like, well, that was kind of meh. Like, well, it was only meh, not because the Grand Canyon changed. Right. There are people who spend months studying and painting and reveling in the transcendent beauty of the Grand Canyon. And that's the same Grand Canyon that you just kind of went, eh. Right. One of the difference isn't in the Grand Canyon. The difference is in you being able to exert yourself to be present with that and appreciate it. Right. Yes. So when we train ourselves to just kind of skim through life, we miss all the beauties as well. Right. So that's one aspect of this. The thing is, though, this applies in the large scale. Once we've trained ourselves in the small scale, this applies in large scale, because this is the lesson of Viktor Frankl in the Nazi concentration camps. Right. Where he, in literal hell on earth, he was able to choose to find meaning in the hardship and thereby find hope, which allowed him to be grateful, which allowed him to choose joy. In a place that everybody would give him full ride on him being grumpy, at least. right? Of being able to say, you don't have to be grateful there. You don't have to find peace there. It's torment, it's trauma, it's evil. By all rights, he should have been miserable.
Yes.
Right. But he chose, even in that place, to find hope, to find joy, to find gratitude. And what's amazing is that when he saw that particular choice being made in himself and the people around him, those are the ones who survived. Those are the ones who had the capacity to encounter that hardship, grow through it, and thereby survive. The people who didn't do that lost hope and perished. Because when they gave up the will to live, they ceased to live. Because the environment was happy to take their life for them whenever they gave up that hope.
Yeah, I think
so. Small scale to large scale, it applies across the board.
Very much so. And it reminds me, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, I believe it's in because I've heard of this is a recognized phenomena in Japan where people have actually given up, aside from walking into the suicide forest, but where they're, and you see this also in elderly folks as well. They lose a partner and they lose their will to live, and they perish. They could have been perfectly healthy very soon after their partner dies.
Yeah. You see this also as a phenomenon with retirees, right? Also, celebrity suicides. Aren't necessarily always because they suddenly lost their wealth. It's because they gained their wealth and it found out that it was meaningless. Right? They spent their entire life sacrificing everything for that end goal, like we're describing, and they arrive at and they realize this is worth anything to me. And I just gave up all of that, and there's suddenly no purpose or meaning left for them, and they've lost that sense of meaning and purpose, and they lose their will to live.
Well, there's a component of identity loss there as well.
100%.
Yeah. I was like, well, I'm no longer the top dog at my firm, and I'm just a old retired guy.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Or I'm just grandpa. Like, is that actually what I wanted?
Does actually mean something to me?
Yeah. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, that pursuit of meaning is something that I meditate on a lot, and another one thing that I find myself out of step with a lot of current society because of that is that I advocate for finding a sense of meaning within community and finding identity within community. And people like to say that, like community is great. Nobody likes to say that community is bad. Right. Yeah. But what they don't realize is that when I say that our identity is shaped within community and the only lasting transformation is found within community, the inverse of that is saying that you don't get to define your own identity. Like the individual path is not a valid path, is the same thing, just told in backwards. And if we try and have a self-referential identity, right, a self-referential source of meaning, it becomes nihilistic. Right. It's like an infinite closed loop that constantly refers back on itself. It just spirals down into nothing. It collapses. It implodes. And we need to have that externality. People say, I don't care what other people think of me. Like, well, you should. Like, there should be a connection there. There should be some kind of a rapport. There should be some kind of give and take and flow of meaning. If you isolate completely, you lose all sense of meaning. And it doesn't mean that you should completely surrender your entire identity to what defaults happens to happen to you, right? There is a self-authoring, there is a self-direction tied to that. But what I believe is that the most self-determining choice that we can make is which traditions and communities we choose to identify with, right? So I can choose to align myself with the Harantog community retreat, like we did together. I chose to become part of that community while we were there, right? And continue on with that. And then I can choose to go be part of the dance community, or I can choose to be part of the ACA community back in Washington that did the banquet and ball part that really introduced me to a lot of this stuff. I can create my own community and my family. I can choose to belong to that. Or I can choose to not. Like my wife's parents and her family became very toxic in a lot of ways. And so we ended up having to kind of separate ourselves and kind of disfellowship. We tried to reconcile things as much as we could, but they weren't having it. And so we eventually effectively just had to we're just not participating in that community anymore. until things change, which I would love for it to change. I'm not closing that door, and we're not burning that bridge. I want to leave that open, but we're also not actively participating in the things that lead to community there, because we don't want that to shape our identity, that toxicity and that negativity and that trauma. And so making that choice to pivot from one into the other is what shapes us. That is what leads to the behavior patterns, those habits, and that are our identity. Those are informed within community. And so when we tend to focus so much on the individual, we tend to lose sight of how much we really, really are shaped by our community.
Yes. I saw an interesting, because for me, I've been delving deep into many Eastern traditions, and an interesting component. And I just saw an interesting article about this just this past weekend of, the difference between Western thought and Eastern thought can be boiled down to a very simple view. Whereas Western thought has a very strong sense of self, and Eastern thought has a very, like, a lack of self, or lack of a view of self. And interestingly enough, we're seeing from a neurological perspective is that what you think of as you doesn't actually exist.
Right.
And many times in meditation practice is we get to observe the thoughts that come up and have that recognition that, these are things that just happen in my head. They're not actually me.
It's noise. It's something that you are perceiving, but it's not you.
Yes. Correct.
Yeah.
In a world like we are, in our modern world, where we have what seems like infinite areas to connect, and yet we don't. What are the types of things that you can recommend from your practices for people in the world who are looking to create more community and connection, or find more community and connection?
Yeah. So this is something that I work with a lot, specifically in dealing with our digital world that we interact with so much. Like I said, there's so many opportunities to connect, particularly online. It's typical what people mean by that. Is that we have the entire world at our fingertips that we can reach out to and connect with and meet people and converse about any number of subjects and find common ground on any number of topics and so on. But we seem to be less and less connected despite that. There's a lot of different aspects that come into play there. But when seeking that sense of real, meaningful, authentic community, if you break it down to how does a community work and what does it do and how does it do it, in terms of like taking a step back from our caricatures that we have now, looking at how has it worked across history, across time, throughout all cultures. What are the commonalities and what things are missing, right? That's what I try and do. So what I think I've developed, eventually I'm going to write a book on this, sneak peek. I believe there's a structure of 4 tiers of belonging. There's the lowest, most atomic level is a one-on-one connection between 2 people like we're having right now, right? It's a conversation in which there's an exchange of vulnerability that is encountered with love, right? So instead of vulnerability exposed and then being exploited, it's encountered with love. And so there's a value exchange that results out of that, and that builds trust. That's the atomic level of just a singular connection. If you extend that through time, you end up with a relationship, right? Once off meeting is not a relationship, it's a connection. You have to have that multiple times, like beads on a string, and that develops a whole story. But if you triangulate that, you go from just 2 people to 3 or more people who have common goal, right? That makes a community. And out of a community, out of a healthy community, things organically emerge. Honor and shame, as far as common values, heroes, origin stories, all kinds of different elements, all these different functions of community emerge organically out of that. But the common thing is that you have 3 more people who have common goal. We're working together towards that. But then if you do the same thing that you do from a connection to relationship and extend that community through time, you end up with a culture, right? So the culture has a mechanism for transmitting values from one generation to the next by means of tradition. And tradition has multiple dimensions to it. And so this is where you get into the challenges of online communities. Because one, it's difficult at a very atomic level. It's difficult to be vulnerable online.
Yeah.
Right. People are curating what they're presenting. They're presenting all of the best and most filtered of themselves. So all you're seeing is perfection, right? And all you're seeing are your own mistakes. And so there's this huge dichotomy between you and the others. And that creates this class system. It also creates imposter syndrome. It creates all these problems, right? So one of the first things you can do is try to create a community of authentic relationships that are built upon trust and via vulnerability. But then having that common goal, that connotation where you're consistently connecting with each other over and over again, and with each other around that common goal, where you have this opportunity to have this emergent process. But the challenge that often comes in play is when I mentioned the dimensions of tradition and how these values are passed on and how they perpetuate and how they robustly reinforce identity. It operates on 3 levels, and it ties in with the thought, word, and deed kind of dynamic. These 3 aspects of who we are, or the good, the true, and the beautiful is another part of that same triad. It happens through story that contextualizes reality. There's narratives that we use to commonly shape environment within a tradition. There is art, which is the emotive expression that captures a sense of this is what we see as beautiful. These are the things that aesthetically define us, right? That also captures that motivating force, because that's where our will, that's where our emotions tie in, is that artistic aspect, which is where most of our decisions are actually made. And then you also have the coaction, the ritual behavior, the practices that you do together that coordinate the actual embodiment of that identity. And so these 3 components have to come in together. So if you're just sitting there listening to information, you might have the story component, but even if it's just informational, you're not even really having a full story there. That's not that's not the same thing, right? But if you're not doing things together, if it's not impacting your day-to-day life, then you don't have a fully functioning tradition, which means you don't have a fully functioning culture, which means you don't have that same integration of identity, right? Similarly, if you don't have a unique aesthetic, if you don't have a common sense of beauty, you're not going to connect to it meaningfully. Which is one of the reasons why I get, as a former web developer, I get really annoyed with modern web design practices, because everything is brought down to a very minimalist level. And it makes it so it's universally the same. We all use the same buttons, the same icons, which is more efficient. It's more intuitive because it's the same thing everywhere, but it also blurs all the boundaries. So you don't know what site you're on just by looking at it. And it's not beautiful to look at either.
If you squint too hard, you might think it's a different website.
Exactly. So there's no sense of identity there. Right. And so that makes it really challenging for being able to create an authentic living tradition and therefore a sense of authentic identity online. So those are 4 big pieces that I think that, just as a short snippet, that I think really can shape our ability to online. And of course, this is a lot easier in person. And we miss this in person because we've actually taken our online practices and then tried to translate it back into the real world. We've forgotten the pieces that are lost in translation. And so we go and we have a corporate boardroom, and it's just as boring as a website. Like, come on, guys, where's the carved lion armchairs and where's the dressing up, and where's the food, and where's the drink, and where's all these things that used to be part of every culture and community that came together in person? Was this sense of presence and place. And these things were meaningful. They were functional. They tied us to, they created a sense of strong identity. And we've just forgotten how to do that.
Yeah, we've created it as a transactional relationship rather than a cohesive one.
Yeah, that pure information exchange rather than building of relationships.
Yeah, us both in the coaching world, like my opinion is that that's what coaching is continuing to build relationships, because we're working to build that relationship with the person to help them to change their behaviors, to help them to change their environment, to change their identity, the beliefs about self. Yeah. And it's hard to do without it. Because
people come to us and they go, like, I don't like the way, like, they often come to us like, I have a problem that's external to me, right? I want this fixed. We have to say, okay, so what needs to change here so that you can relate to that better to get you to a better place to interact with that, right? So you have to kind of shift that problem, that pain point from this is an external problem to I don't like the way I am.
Yes.
Because then once that happens, then you can say, okay, now I can change the way I am to be the way I ought to be or the way I want to be, so that I can better interact with the world and deal with the issues that are in front of me consistently for the rest of my life.
Yeah, because it comes back to that idea of transactionality of, I'm just looking for, just tell me what to do. I need more things to do. I need more things to do. So right. Nobody ever. With that, are there any things that you would like to share with the audience? Things that you're bringing forward in the world and you'd like to share and promote?
Sure. So I have several different projects that I'm working on. Most of them revolve around this idea that we've actually been discussing. Two in particular, I have my business, my coaching business, Catalytic Conversations. If you go to stressredemption.com, that'll send you to my website. And the whole idea of stress redemption is this idea of leaning into and embracing the challenges of life in a meaningful way so that we can convert stress into growth instead of into burnout, which cripples us, which is a crippled state of being. So helping people shape their identities. And there's very accessible tiers, there's free trainings available, as well as personalized coaching that I can offer people. I love to work with people who are, growth minded, who want to invest in becoming elite change agents in the world around them to help other people learn these same principles as well. So that's really what I'm looking for there. Similar to that, I also have the nonprofit that I'm launching, the Academy of Sage Heroes, which is all about the shaping of heroes, people who have an impact on society, does society have an impact on them, using experiential education, immersive events, and these kinds of things. It's a fraternal organization type collaborative education society where people come together to do common practices that are pulled from old traditions that are made new in today's society, not to reenact an old past or to turn back progress in a sense, but to take the moment that we have in front of us and make something great of it. So we do sword fighting, we do dancing, we do dining, we do banquets, we do all kinds of different things, reading essays and conversing deeply and with beauty around them. So I'm experimenting with lots of different modalities for that. If people are interested in participating, they can go to ash.academy or reach out to me as well. And we can figure out a way to incorporate them into the culture and the community there.
Fantastic. Since we've met just over a year ago and hearing all of the things that you've been doing and having a taste of some of them in person, there are so many cool opportunities for it. So if you are interested, listeners, and available, I would definitely suggest reaching out to Jaymes.
Love to have you.
Yeah. With that, we're at a natural wrapping up point for today. So first, I want to express my gratitude for you making the time today to talk with me on this podcast and to share yourself, because
thank you for having me, Jeremy.
You're very welcome, sir. Yeah. With that, we'll wrap it up. Until next time, folks, stay strong, stay weird.